History is often told as the story of great kings, mighty battles, and monumental palaces, but hidden between those familiar pages are figures who quietly reshaped empires. Imagine a woman who began life as the daughter of refugees, widowed at a young age, and yet rose to command the wealthiest and most powerful empire of her time. She was not simply the wife of an emperor. She signed decrees with her own hand, minted coins in her own name, and designed monuments that would inspire some of the most iconic architecture in the world. Her influence stretched from the battlefield to the treasury, from court politics to the fashion of the empire, and even to the daily lives of ordinary citizens. Her name was Nur Jahan, and although she stood at the very heart of Mughal power in the 17th century, history has too often left her in the shadows. To understand her is to unravel a tale of ambition, intelligence, and resilience that defied the expectations of her time. She moved from the private chambers of the harem to the open exercise of statecraft, becoming one of the only women in South Asian history to wield such direct authority. She was a visionary in art, a strategist in politics, and a guardian of the empire's prosperity. Yet her story is not only about power. It is also about how history remembers and forgets, how women who break boundaries are celebrated in whispers or condemned in ink, and how legacies can be etched in both stone and silence. To explore her life is to confront our own assumptions about leadership and to rediscover a figure who deserves her place among the architects of one of the world's greatest empires. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video we will uncover the extraordinary life of Nur Jahan, the overlooked empress who ruled from behind the throne and left a legacy still visible today. Nur Jahan remains one of the most fascinating yet often overlooked figures in the long history of the Mughal Empire. When people think of Mughal India, the usual names that come to mind are Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, or Aurangzeb. Their reigns, policies, and monumental achievements dominate most narratives. The Taj Mahal, Fatehpur Sikri, the Red Fort, and stories of military campaigns or court intrigues are often placed at the center of our understanding. In such a male-dominated telling, the remarkable story of a woman who not only shaped court politics, but also left her mark on art, architecture, and governance itself tends to remain hidden in the margins. Nur Jahan, wife of Emperor Jahangir, was not simply a consort confined to the harem. She was a commanding presence, a woman who wielded authority in ways that few others in her position could imagine, and yet her name is not as well known as those of her male counterparts. This imbalance in recognition is what makes her story both intriguing and essential to revisit. The idea that the Mughal world was only shaped by emperors reflects a common misconception that history belongs solely to men in power. Yet empires are sustained and shaped by many forces, including the influence of women who often worked from behind the curtain. Nur Jahan stands out not only because she managed to step out from behind that curtain, but also because she made her presence felt openly and effectively in the politics of the empire. She did this in a court and a culture where female authority was far from the norm. Her life is a reminder that the Mughal period, while patriarchal, still allowed for extraordinary exceptions that challenge how we understand gender and power in pre-modern South Asia. Born as Mera Nissa, Nur Jahan entered the Mughal court not as a princess or noblewoman from birth, but through the pathways of marriage and circumstance. Her family had come from Persia and established itself in India during Akbar's reign. She first married Shah Afghan, a Mughal nobleman, but after his death she lived a period of widowhood before eventually marrying Jahangir in her 30s. This alone made her an unusual figure, since widows of her time, even those from noble backgrounds, rarely remarried with such consequence. Once she entered the emperor's household, her intelligence, taste, and political skill quickly became apparent. Jahangir himself was often distracted by personal pleasures and struggles with health and addiction. Nur Jahan stepped into that space, and instead of merely being a supportive wife, she assumed a role that shaped the direction of the empire. Her genius did not rest in military conquest, but in the quieter yet equally important fields of governance and culture. She was the only Mughal empress to have her name inscribed on coins, a striking symbol of her authority. She issued orders, signed imperial decrees, and managed factions at court with skill. The balance she maintained between various nobles, her ability to navigate rivalries, and her strategic alliances made her a central figure in the administration of the empire. To place this in perspective, for a woman in the early 17th century to hold such authority was extraordinary. It was not that the Mughal world lacked influential women. Babur's grandmother Itimad-ud-Daulah Begum had been instrumental in his rise, and Akbar's mother Hamida Banu Begum held respect. But Nur Jahan's level of direct control was exceptional. She blurred the line between emperor and empress, showing that authority could be embodied in ways that defied expectation. One of the reasons her legacy deserves greater recognition is her role in the arts and architecture. The Mughal period is often remembered for grand monuments, most famously the Taj Mahal built by Shah Jahan in memory of Mumtaz Mahal, who happens to have been Nur Jahan's niece. While Mumtaz is remembered primarily as the inspiration behind one of the world's most iconic structures, Nur Jahan was herself a patron and designer whose vision shaped several works. She was directly involved in the design and commissioning of tombs and gardens, particularly in Agra and Lahore. The tomb of her father, Itimad-ud-Daulah, often referred to as the Baby Taj, is considered a precursor to the Taj Mahal. Its use of white marble, inlay work, and delicate design elements influenced later Mughal architecture. Nur Jahan's personal taste and involvement in its creation are well documented, making her one of the few women in history who directly shaped the architectural language of her time. Her contribution to architecture was not merely decorative. The tombs and gardens she patronized reflected deep thought about aesthetics, memory, and the symbolic power of space. Mughal gardens were designed as representations of paradise on earth, and Nur Jahan was an innovator in how these spaces were imagined. The way water, pathways, and symmetry were employed in her projects show both refinement and vision. Through these works, she participated in defining the cultural grandeur of the Mughal Empire, even though credit has rarely flowed to her in the same way it has to male emperors. Her political influence, meanwhile, was both admired and resented in her time. Courtiers who benefited from her favor praised her wisdom, while others who lost power under her watch criticized her influence. Contemporary chroniclers often wrote with bias, some unable to accept the idea of a woman exercising such open authority. Over time, this bias contributed to how her image was shaped in history. She was sometimes portrayed as manipulative, accused of using her position only to advance her own family. Yet closer examination reveals that what she did was not fundamentally different from the practices of powerful men at court, who also relied on family and networks to strengthen their positions. Nur Jahan was judged by a different standard, and that difference has clouded her reputation. The misconception that Mughal history is solely about emperors leaves little room for such nuance. When people recount the Mughal legacy, they usually highlight the expansion under Akbar, the cultural brilliance of Shah Jahan's reign, or the religious policies of Aurangzeb. Rarely do they pause to consider the period of Jahangir's reign as one where his wife played a central role in sustaining the empire. Without Nur Jahan's leadership, Jahangir's reign may have drifted further into instability. She not only helped maintain the administrative machinery, but also fostered stability through her diplomacy. She managed relations with nobles, gave patronage to artists, and kept the empire's cultural vibrancy alive even when the emperor himself was less engaged. Her story also unsettles the common narrative about women in pre-modern Islamic empires being entirely secluded. While the Mughal harem was a protected and private space, it was also a place of influence, where decisions were discussed and strategies formed. Nur Jahan transcended even that role by moving into the public sphere of politics. Her ability to navigate between the expectations of modesty and the demands of authority demonstrates a rare flexibility. She did not discard the cultural framework of her time, but worked within it to extend its boundaries. That balance is part of what made her effective and also enigmatic to later historians. If her legacy has been overlooked, it is partly because the next generations of Mughal history produced such overwhelming figures. Shah Jahan's architectural feats, Aurangzeb's vast conquests, and the eventual decline of the empire created dramatic narratives that historians found more compelling. The quieter yet profound contributions of Nur Jahan seemed less visible in comparison. Yet in many ways, she paved the path for what was to come. The architectural style that reached its peak in the Taj Mahal had roots in her projects. The administrative stability that allowed Jahangir's reign to continue without collapse was due in no small measure to her. Even her cultural patronage in textiles, perfumes, and decorative arts left an imprint on Mughal taste and identity. To understand Nur Jahan is to recognize that power in history does not always take the form of armies or conquests. Sometimes it appears in the ability to guide an empire from within, to influence decisions, and to leave behind cultural and artistic legacies that endure long after names have faded. Her genius was not loud, but it was transformative. The Mughal story, when told in its full richness, cannot be complete without acknowledging the empress who signed decrees, issued coins, designed tombs, and balanced power in one of the greatest courts of her age. Her life also raises questions about how we remember history. Why do some figures become central, while others remain footnotes? Why are women's contributions so often cast as secondary or dismissed as mere extensions of their husbands' roles? By asking these questions, we not only bring justice to the memory of figures like Nur Jahan, but also challenge the way history itself is written. The overlooked empress deserves to be remembered not as a shadow of Jahangir, but as a leader in her own right, one who combined intellect, creativity, and political acumen to leave a mark on an empire that still fascinates the world. Her rise to power seems even more remarkable when one considers the circumstances of her birth and childhood. Nur Jahan, originally named Mera Nissa, was not born into the highest circles of Mughal nobility. Her family came from Persia, and though they were of respectable standing there, their move to India was driven by need rather than ambition. They arrived in search of a more stable life during the reign of Akbar, carrying little more than their skills and hopes for a better future. Her father, Mirza Ghiyas Beg, managed to secure employment in the Mughal administration. This beginning, rooted in exile and the struggles of a refugee family, sets Nur Jahan apart from many of her contemporaries in the imperial court. Unlike princesses born within the empire or daughters of entrenched noble families, she entered the Mughal world as an outsider. Her life was not marked by privilege at the start, but by resilience, adaptability, and the constant navigation of uncertain fortunes. Growing up in this environment, Nur Jahan developed a keen awareness of the fragile balance between security and loss. It shaped her into a woman with a sharp mind, capable of reading situations with care and acting decisively when the moment demanded. Her intelligence was matched by an appreciation for beauty and refinement, qualities that later defined her taste in the arts and architecture. When she first married Shir Afghan, a loyal nobleman in Akbar's service, her life appeared to be one of quiet respectability. Yet destiny was not finished with her. The sudden death of her husband left her widowed at an age when most women in her position would have withdrawn into obscurity. The fact that she later married Jahangir in her 30s, and that this marriage changed the course of history, already speaks to her unusual journey. Widowhood, rather than ending her prospects, became a stage from which she emerged stronger and more influential. Her marriage to Jahangir was no ordinary union. The emperor was already deeply experienced in court life, governance, and personal struggle. He had lived under the shadow of his father Akbar, one of the greatest rulers in Mughal history, and had taken the throne with expectations resting heavily on him. Yet Jahangir was a man of contradictions. He was intellectually curious, fond of art and nature, but also troubled by personal vices such as excessive drinking and opium use. His reign risked being undermined by these weaknesses, and into this environment stepped Nur Jahan. At first, she did not wield power openly. She entered the court as a wife, and the expectation was that she would live as many royal consorts did, maintaining her dignity within the harem and leaving political matters to the emperor and his ministers. But Nur Jahan was not content to remain on the sidelines. Slowly, she began to exert her influence, though at the start it was subtle and carefully measured. The harem itself was a world of quiet power. It was not simply a space of seclusion, as is often imagined in popular accounts, but a place where conversations, alliances, and decisions often began. Within its walls, women influenced the course of events indirectly, through persuasion and networks of kinship. Nur Jahan mastered this environment, using her intellect and charm to earn respect and trust. Jahangir valued her companionship deeply, and she learned how to guide his attention toward matters of governance. Over time, her role shifted from personal confidant to political partner. This transformation did not happen overnight, but grew as Jahangir increasingly relied on her judgment. By advising him, shaping his decisions, and cultivating her own relationships with courtiers, she laid the foundation for her eventual prominence. The unique political climate of the time created the conditions that allowed her influence to expand in unprecedented ways. The Mughal Empire under Jahangir was stable, but also vulnerable. Akbar had left behind a vast and diverse realm that required careful management to prevent rebellion or fragmentation. Jahangir, while competent in many ways, was not as energetic or disciplined as his father. His struggles with health and addiction meant that the court often needed a steadying hand. This gap in leadership created opportunities for those close to him to play larger roles, and Nur Jahan stepped into this space with remarkable skill. Rather than acting impulsively, she observed, calculated, and then acted when the timing was right. Another factor that enabled her rise was the structure of the Mughal court itself. The empire functioned through a balance of factions, with nobles from different regions and backgrounds competing for favor. In such an environment, the support of the emperor or those close to him was crucial. Nur Jahan recognized this and built her own network of alliances. She promoted her family members into key positions, including her father and brother, ensuring that her influence was not isolated but extended across the machinery of government. While some critics later accused her of nepotism, her actions were no different from the practices of powerful men at court, who likewise relied on their kin and loyalists to secure power. What distinguished her was that she, as a woman, was able to use these strategies in a way that placed her at the center of authority. Her early influence manifested in symbolic as well as practical ways. The coins minted in her name, alongside Jahangir's, stand as powerful evidence of how far her authority reached. No other Mughal empress before or after enjoyed such recognition. She began to issue decrees, sign documents, and directly involve herself in state affairs. This visibility marked a turning point, for she was no longer just guiding from behind the scenes, but had become a recognized political actor. Such boldness was only possible because the empire itself needed her. In a moment when Jahangir could not fully shoulder the demands of empire, Nur Jahan provided the stability and decisiveness required to keep governance intact. Her rise from refugee child to the head of state challenges the assumptions we often carry about pre-modern empires. It suggests that while the Mughal court was hierarchical and patriarchal, it also had spaces of flexibility where extraordinary individuals could alter the rules. Nur Jahan's authority was not handed to her. She claimed it by demonstrating competence, building networks, and earning the trust of those around her. At the same time, she had to navigate the dangers of resentment and suspicion, for her power was not universally welcomed. Some nobles resented her growing role, fearing the loss of their own influence. Yet she proved capable of balancing these tensions, using both diplomacy and firmness to maintain her position. Her story at this stage, moving from the harem into the corridors of state power, is best understood not as a sudden leap, but as a gradual unfolding. Each step, from her background as the daughter of refugees, to her survival as a widow, to her careful maneuvering in Jahangir's court, prepared her for the authority she later exercised. It was a journey defined by resilience and intelligence, but also by timing and circumstance. The empire needed someone like her, and she was prepared to step into that role. Her rise tells us that history is not shaped only by those born into privilege, but also by those who seize the opportunities that chance and skill place before them. Her transition from a guiding presence in Jahangir's private life to a commanding force in the political sphere did not take long to become visible. Once her position was secure, she began to act with the authority of someone who understood the empire's needs and her own place within it. Her hand in state affairs was direct, deliberate, and unmistakable. She was not satisfied with the passive influence that many queens across the world were expected to exercise. Instead, she signed royal decrees herself, had her name inscribed on imperial coins alongside the emperor's, and oversaw the issuance of firmans that carried binding authority. This was a bold act, for the minting of coins symbolized sovereignty itself. By placing her name there, she was making a statement that her authority was not derivative or secondary, but an active element in governance. These were not mere tokens of affection from Jahangir, but acknowledgments of the reality that she was steering the empire's direction. Her political influence was also visible in her involvement with military affairs. While she did not lead armies into battle, she advised on campaigns, weighed in on strategies, and used her position to direct resources. Jahangir's reign faced several challenges, including rebellions and frontier conflicts. His own ability to manage them was limited by his personal struggles, but Nur Jahan's mind was sharp and practical. She understood the balance between negotiation and force. At times, her counsel leaned toward compromise to prevent bloodshed, while in other cases, she pushed for decisive action to protect imperial authority. Accounts suggest that she accompanied Jahangir on campaigns, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant in planning and logistics. Her presence in such matters was extraordinary for a woman of her era, demonstrating how deeply she had crossed into spheres usually reserved for men. Yet Nur Jahan's genius extended beyond the mechanics of statecraft into the world of culture, design, and architecture. The Mughal Empire is often remembered for its monumental architecture, and rightly so, but too often the contributions of women like her are erased or credited entirely to emperors. The tomb of her father, Itimad-ud-Daulah, is perhaps the clearest example of her vision. This structure, often called the Baby Taj, introduced innovations that later shaped the Taj Mahal. Its white marble surface, the inlay of semi-precious stones, and the delicate lattice screens reflected a new refinement in Mughal aesthetics. These choices were not Jahangir's but Nur Jahan's, for she took personal interest in the project, overseeing its design and execution. This tomb was not simply a monument to her father, but a declaration of her own role as a cultural architect of the empire. She also designed and commissioned gardens that became famous for their beauty and symbolic meaning. The Mughals saw gardens as earthly reflections of paradise, spaces where nature and order were brought together to suggest harmony. Nur Jahan introduced refinements in their layout, emphasizing symmetry and the integration of water features. These gardens were not only personal retreats, but also spaces of political performance, where the emperor and empress could receive visitors in settings that communicated authority and elegance. Her architectural work was part of a larger cultural vision, to shape how the empire expressed itself visually, to turn its power into beauty, and to leave behind a landscape that testified to her taste. Many of her innovations, however, were attributed to Jahangir or absorbed into the collective memory of Mughal architecture without her name attached. Later generations praised the grandeur of Shah Jahan's buildings while overlooking the fact that his vision was shaped by the experiments carried out under Nur Jahan. She laid down the aesthetic foundation on which others built. The absence of her name from many records reflects how history often strips women of their creative authorship, reassigning it to the men around them. Yet the stylistic shift during her period is too striking to ignore, and the evidence of her direct involvement makes it clear that she was a pioneer in her own right. Beyond politics and architecture, she also reshaped the economic life of the empire. Nur Jahan had a sharp sense of finance and understood that prosperity was as important as power. She paid close attention to the empire's revenues, trade, and the production of goods. One of her most notable contributions was her involvement in the development and promotion of textiles. She had a refined eye for design and helped popularize new styles in fabrics and clothing, particularly those worn in the court. These textiles became sought after, not only within the empire, but also in trade with foreign merchants. By influencing fashion, she indirectly stimulated industries that brought wealth and prestige to the Mughal realm. Her policies also reflected a shrewd understanding of international trade. The 17th century was a time of increasing contact between India and European trading companies, particularly the Portuguese, English, and Dutch. These foreign merchants were eager to secure privileges, and Nur Jahan recognized both the opportunities and the dangers they represented. She ensured that trade remained under imperial control and resisted excessive concessions that could undermine sovereignty. At the same time, she encouraged the growth of industries that made Mughal goods competitive in global markets. The balance she struck between openness and control helped the empire maintain its prosperity during a time of expanding global commerce. She was also attentive to the empire's fiscal stability. Jahangir's personal habits could have drained resources, but Nur Jahan's discipline helped keep the finances intact. She monitored expenditures, curtailed unnecessary extravagance, and ensured that revenues from taxation were used effectively. Critics accused her of hoarding wealth for herself and her family, but the broader picture shows that she played a vital role in maintaining economic order. Without her, the empire might have faced greater instability, for financial mismanagement was often the first step toward political decline in pre-modern states. What makes her economic vision particularly striking is how it complemented her cultural and political roles. She did not see governance, architecture, and finance as separate spheres. For her, they were interconnected. The prosperity generated by careful management funded the monuments and gardens she built. The beauty of those monuments enhanced the prestige of the empire, which in turn strengthened its political position. Her influence in trade and fashion reinforced her image as a leader whose touch extended into every corner of imperial life. This integrated vision of power, culture, and economy was rare and contributed to her unique position. Her role as the unseen hand of power becomes clearer when we consider how seamlessly she combined these different aspects of authority. She could sign a decree one day, advise on a military decision the next, oversee the construction of a garden the following week, and still find time to regulate trade or support artisans. Few figures in Mughal history displayed such range. Jahangir, despite being emperor, often appeared more as her partner than her superior. Their relationship, while based on affection, was also a political partnership in which Nur Jahan often played the leading role. Her power, however, was not without challenges. Some nobles bristled at her authority, unwilling to accept a woman directing imperial affairs. Rebellions and rivalries at court sometimes targeted her family, seeing them as the instruments of her dominance. Yet she held her ground, relying on her intelligence and her ability to manage alliances. What is remarkable is not just that she gained such power, but that she sustained it for so long in such a contested environment. This endurance testifies to her political acumen and the respect she commanded among those who mattered most. The unseen hand of Nur Jahan reveals itself not only in the visible achievements, but also in the stability she preserved. Empires are fragile, and small failures in leadership can lead to large collapses. Jahangir's reign, without her, might have faltered under the weight of internal and external pressures. With her, it managed to maintain continuity, prosperity, and cultural vibrancy. Her authority was not always celebrated, and sometimes it was resented, but it was indispensable. She represents a model of power that was neither loud nor ostentatious, but effective and enduring. Her story at this stage reminds us that history often overlooks the complexity of women's roles in empire. Nur Jahan did not only stand beside Jahangir, she stood at the heart of governance. Her decrees, her designs, and her financial strategies were part of the fabric of Mughal rule. To see her as simply the emperor's wife is to misunderstand the nature of her contribution. She was, in truth, the empire's co-sovereign, even if official titles never admitted it. The enduring measure of Nur Jahan's power and vision is not only found in the annals of court politics or the records of decrees and campaigns, but also in the very stones that still stand centuries after her time. Her legacy lives in the architecture she inspired, in the gardens she designed, and in the cultural shifts she set in motion. It also lives in the reforms and acts of charity that touched the lives of countless ordinary people, who may never have seen her in person but benefited from the policies she shaped. What sets her apart is how she managed to connect the grandeur of imperial culture with the practical realities of governance and human welfare. Her influence, at once visible and invisible, was not confined to her lifetime but created foundations that later generations of the Mughal dynasty built upon. To understand her true legacy, one must see it not only in monuments of marble, but also in the lives of the empire's citizens and in the cultural vibrancy that flourished long after she was gone. Her most visible contribution remains in architecture, and the clearest example is the tomb of her father, Itimad-ud-Daulah, in Agra. This monument represents a turning point in Mughal architectural history. Before it, Mughal tombs were grand, but often constructed with red sandstone as the primary material. Nur Jahan introduced the use of white marble as the dominant surface, setting the stage for the full flowering of this style in the Taj Mahal. The tomb of Itimad-ud-Daulah also featured delicate inlay work, with semi-precious stones embedded into marble in intricate patterns, a technique known as pietra dura. The refined lattice screens, the geometric precision, and the elegance of proportion all marked a new aesthetic vision. It was Nur Jahan's hand that guided this project, not simply as a patron, but as someone deeply engaged in the design. The choices she made reflected both Persian influences from her heritage and the evolving Mughal taste for synthesis and innovation. Later monuments that defined Mughal architecture, including the Taj Mahal, owe much to the precedent she established. Her vision became the language through which imperial memory was expressed. Beyond this famous tomb, her influence can be traced in other projects as well. She commissioned gardens, palaces, and smaller tombs, many of which embodied her distinctive aesthetic. The Shalimar Gardens in Kashmir, developed during her time, reflect her love for symmetry, flowing water, and integration of natural beauty with human design. These gardens were more than ornamental. They embodied political symbolism, representing the emperor's ability to bring order and beauty into the world. Nur Jahan understood this symbolism well, and through her gardens she reinforced the majesty of the Mughal court. Even when attributed to Jahangir or later rulers, the imprint of her taste is unmistakable. It is one of the ironies of history that her contributions have often been absorbed into the credit given to male emperors, yet the stylistic shift that occurred under her guidance is too clear to ignore. Architecture, however, was only one part of her legacy. She was equally committed to reforms that reached ordinary people. Despite her immense power, she did not lose sight of the responsibilities of rulership, and she used her influence to advance charitable works. She established sarais or rest houses along important travel routes, providing shelter and safety for merchants, pilgrims, and travelers. These rest houses encouraged trade and communication, helping to knit the empire together. She also supported the building of wells and stepwells, ensuring access to water in regions where scarcity threatened daily life. Such projects, though less glamorous than marble tombs, had a direct impact on the welfare of the people and demonstrated her understanding that prosperity depended not only on grand displays, but also on practical measures that eased hardship. Nur Jahan also championed the role of women in ways that were subtle yet meaningful. She promoted industries where women could participate, particularly in textiles, embroidery, and handicrafts. The fabrics she designed and popularized, such as new styles of muslin and silk, created opportunities for women to engage in production and earn livelihoods. By elevating these designs to the level of court fashion, she gave them prestige and value in both domestic and international markets. This not only enriched the empire's economy, but also enhanced the social standing of women artisans. Her leadership shows how cultural influence could intersect with economic empowerment, creating ripple effects far beyond the walls of the palace. Her charity also extended to direct relief in times of crisis. During periods of famine or hardship, she is recorded as having organized food distribution and supported the poor. She financed dowries for orphaned girls, enabling them to marry with dignity, and she took personal interest in ensuring that widows and vulnerable women were not left destitute. These actions were not merely acts of generosity, but deliberate efforts to shape the moral image of the Mughal court. By positioning herself as a provider and protector, she reinforced her legitimacy as a ruler in spirit, even if not in title. She understood that the power of an empire rested as much on the loyalty and goodwill of its people as on the strength of its armies or the wealth of its treasuries. Her reforms in finance and trade also had lasting consequences. By promoting stability in economic policy, ensuring revenues were collected fairly, and supporting industries like textiles, she laid the groundwork for the empire's prosperity in the following decades. The 17th century was a period of increasing contact between India and global markets, and the Mughal Empire played a central role in this exchange. Nur Jahan's careful oversight of trade and her insistence on maintaining imperial control over key resources ensured that the empire remained strong in this competitive environment. Her policies allowed the Mughals to project confidence abroad and maintain their prestige as one of the wealthiest realms of the early modern world. In this way, her actions laid the foundations for the flourishing of Mughal culture under later rulers. The stability she preserved during Jahangir's reign allowed Shah Jahan to embark on his grand architectural projects, including the Taj Mahal, which would become the most famous symbol of the dynasty. Without the groundwork of political order, economic prosperity, and aesthetic innovation that she provided, the later golden age of Mughal culture might not have been possible. Her legacy thus extended beyond her own lifetime, influencing not only her immediate circle, but shaping the very trajectory of the dynasty. The spirit of her leadership also had intangible but profound effects. She demonstrated that women could hold authority without destabilizing the order of the empire, a lesson that resonated in subtle ways throughout Mughal history. Although no later empress matched her level of influence, her example remained a point of reference, proof that gender did not necessarily define capacity for leadership. She stretched the boundaries of what was possible within her cultural and historical context, and in doing so, she left behind a model of resilience and capability that still inspires reflection today. Her legacy was not without contestation. Critics in her own time and later periods accused her of ambition, manipulation, and nepotism. Yet such charges must be seen in light of the fact that similar behaviors in men were often praised as statesmanship or shrewdness. What her detractors revealed was less about her faults and more about the discomfort caused by her authority. The endurance of her achievements, both in stone and in the prosperity of her era, speaks louder than these criticisms. The tombs still stand, the gardens still bloom, and the cultural shifts she initiated still echo in the art and architecture of India. To walk through the marble corridors of the tomb of Itimad-ud-Daulah, or to wander in the Shalimar Gardens, is to encounter her vision across centuries. To study the fabrics and patterns that became fashionable in her time is to see her influence on daily life and industry. To examine the records of her decrees and charitable works is to glimpse her concern for the people she ruled. Together, these fragments of her life form a picture of a leader who combined grandeur with practicality, vision with compassion. Her story is not only one of personal triumph, but of an empire shaped in quiet, but enduring ways by the hand of a woman who refused to remain invisible. The Mughal Empire is often remembered for its emperors, but in truth it was also defined by those who stood beside them, behind them, or sometimes above them in influence. Nur Jahan's life is a reminder that history is more complex than its official chronicles. Her legacy, etched in stone and spirit, continues to call for recognition, urging us to see beyond the surface of imperial power and to acknowledge the woman who, from the harem to the head of state, left her indelible mark on one of the greatest empires of her time. The story of Nur Jahan, despite all the evidence of her brilliance, influence, and lasting contributions, has often been written at the margins of history. This erasure was not accidental, but the result of centuries of chroniclers and historians privileging male figures, focusing on emperors while reducing women to roles of ornament or inspiration. Even in the Mughal court itself, the discomfort many nobles felt toward her authority translated into records that sought to downplay her role or frame her as an ambitious manipulator. Over time, those portrayals hardened into accepted truths, shaping how generations remembered her. Yet if we pause and look carefully at the facts, the decrees signed in her name, the coins that bore her authority, the monuments that reflect her vision, the reforms that carried her signature, there is no denying that she was one of the most consequential leaders of her era. The fact that her name is often missing from mainstream accounts reveals more about the biases of history than about the reality of her achievements. One reason she was sidelined lies in the traditional discomfort with women in power. Across cultures and times, women who stepped into overt political authority were often judged by harsher standards than men. Their actions, when successful, were rarely credited to them alone, and when contested, they were framed as evidence of dangerous ambition. Nur Jahan was no exception. Chroniclers who admired Jahangir's reign hesitated to attribute its stability to his wife, even when her influence was obvious. Others, jealous of her authority, described her as manipulative, accusing her of ruling through the emperor rather than with him. In truth, she was both partner and leader, but the language of manipulation provided a convenient way to dismiss her as an interloper in the male domain of politics. Another factor was the overwhelming shadow cast by later events in Mughal history. The Taj Mahal built by Shah Jahan became the symbol of Mughal grandeur, eclipsing earlier achievements in architecture and design. The military campaigns of Aurangzeb, the eventual decline of the empire, and the dramatic shifts of the 18th century all drew attention away from the subtler but foundational work of Nur Jahan. She was not a conqueror, and her monuments, though exquisite, were not built on the same massive scale as later projects. In the narrative arc of empire, her story seemed less dramatic, less suited to the sweeping accounts of rise and fall that many historians preferred to tell. Yet her quieter legacy, rooted in aesthetics, governance, and reform, was in many ways more transformative than the battles or conquests that often define kings. The sidelining of her story also reflects the tendency to equate empire with spectacle. Historians and visitors alike have marveled at towering forts, massive palaces, and tales of military glory. Nur Jahan's genius, though visible in monuments like the tomb of Itimad-ud-Daulah, also resided in smaller details. In the design of gardens, in the introduction of fashion that influenced industries, in the careful financial oversight that stabilized an empire vulnerable to its emperor's weaknesses. These were not easily dramatized in chronicles, and so they were neglected, even though they shaped the empire's strength in profound ways. The unseen hand of her leadership was too subtle to fit the grand narratives of conquest, and so it was forgotten or deliberately minimized. Reclaiming her narrative requires us to look differently at history. It asks us to see power not only in the roar of armies or the splendor of marble domes, but also in the steady hand that guided decisions, the taste that shaped culture, and the compassion that directed charity. Nur Jahan's story invites us to reconsider what it means to lead. Her authority was neither an accident nor merely the result of her marriage to Jahangir. It was earned through intelligence, vision, and resilience. She seized opportunities created by circumstance, but she also created opportunities by her own skill. To ignore this is to ignore the truth of how empires are sustained, not only by kings but by those around them whose labor and insight make their reigns possible. By revisiting her story, we also shine a light on the broader question of how many other figures have been erased or diminished in the telling of history. Nur Jahan is a striking example, but she is not alone. Across the world, women, minorities, and marginalized groups have shaped societies in ways that are rarely acknowledged. The very process of history writing has often been selective, elevating some voices while silencing others. To reclaim her narrative is not just to honor one woman, but to remind ourselves that the past is richer and more complex than the narrow versions we inherit. It is to challenge ourselves to ask whose stories are missing and why, and to commit to listening for the echoes that remain in stones, documents, and traditions. Her enduring legacy is not simply the tombs and gardens that bear her influence, nor the coins that once carried her name, but the example she set by living a life that broke boundaries. She showed that authority could come from intellect and vision, that women could govern with as much skill and foresight as men, and that the prosperity of an empire depended on care for both grandeur and ordinary welfare. She blurred the line between ruler and consort, between private influence and public power, leaving behind a model of leadership that still resonates. When we walk through the marble corridors of Agra or the flowing gardens of Kashmir, when we study the textiles and patterns that emerged from her patronage, when we read of the decrees she signed and the charities she founded, we are reminded that history cannot be told fully without her. To continue to write her out is to repeat the mistake of those who feared her power. To write her back in is to do justice not only to her memory, but to the truth of the Mughal story. Nur Jahan deserves to be remembered not as a shadow behind Jahangir, not as a manipulator whispered about by jealous courtiers, but as a ruler in her own right. She was the architect of vision and prosperity, the guardian of stability, and the innovator of culture. Her life reminds us that empires are not only built by emperors. They are also built by those whose names may be overlooked, but whose actions define the course of history. Her rightful place is among the true architects of the Mughal Empire. To reclaim her narrative is to affirm that leadership can wear many faces and that power, when guided by intelligence and compassion, leaves a legacy far greater than conquest alone. Centuries have passed, but her influence endures, engraved both in stone and in spirit, calling us to remember her not as an exception, but as an essential part of the empire's story.